last episode, we closed the chapter on Reconstruction, a time of promise, struggle, and transformation. The war had ended, slavery was gone, but the nation's wounds were still fresh. Now, the story shifts. America is ready to grow again, outward, westward, faster than ever before. Steel rails will stretch across the continent. Boom towns will rise overnight. Cowboys, farmers, immigrants, and dreamers will all chase a new kind of freedom, not political, but economic. This is the era where the United States stops just surviving and starts reshaping itself into a modern nation. Welcome back to US History Understanding This Country. If you have been enjoying the journey so far, please consider sharing this podcast, leave a rating, or even just telling a friend. Your support keeps the wheel turning. And trust me, this episode is going to be a long ride. Let's begin where the East meets the West, where iron tracks meet ambition. By the 1860s and 70s, the United States was still one country on paper, but in many ways it felt like two separate worlds. To the east, cities buzzed with energy. Places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were thick with chimney smokes and ambition. Factories hummed, immigrants poured in through ports, and telegraph wires stitched together a fast moving world of business, news, and politics. This was the land of railroads, newspapers, banknotes, and rising towers. But to the west, past Mississippi River, lay a very different story. The West was wide open, rolling plains, dry deserts, deep canyons, and snowy peaks. It was home to millions of buffalo, dozens of Native American nations, and a growing number of settlers, adventurers, and opportunists. Some came to ranch, some to farm, some to dig for gold or silver, and some simply to disappear. For many Americans, especially in the East, the West represented freedom and possibility. The idea that no matter who you were or where you came from, you could go west and make something of it yourself. It was romantic, it was dangerous, and many of times it was messy. After the Civil War, that western push exploded. Thousands of veterans, both black and white, headed out looking for new lives. Newly freed black families moved west to escape violence and poverty in the south. European immigrants, hearing tales of open land, boarded ships to join the Great Migration. But let's be honest, the open land wasn't really empty. Native American nations had lived there for centuries, with cultures, governments, and spiritual traditions deeply tied to the land. As settlers moved in, conflicts followed. Treaties were broken, wars were fought, and displacement became government policy. The meeting of East and West was never a gentle handshake, it was often a collision. Still, the idea of bringing these two halves of the country together burnt bright in the American imagination. Not just to unify the land, but to unify the economy, the culture, and the future. But how do you tie a continent together when it's over 3,000 miles wide? You lay down iron rails. You build bridges over rivers and blast tunnels through mountains. You send locomotives puffing across prairies like steel horses. Because in 19th century, the train wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of progress, of motion, of America itself. Fast, loud, ambitious, and unstoppable. And the biggest, boldest projects of all of them was about to begin. The Transcontinental Railroad. It was one of the most ambitious construction projects the world have ever seen. An idea so bold, so vast, it seemed almost impossible. The Transcontinental Railroad would link the Atlantic to the Pacific, the bustling cities of East to the rugged frontiers of the West. It would carry people, goods, dreams, and ambitions across mountains, rivers, deserts, and plains. And in doing so, it would transform the United States into a truly connected nation. Before the railroad, a trip from New York to California would take 6 months by wagons. We discussed the same in the episodes 19 and 20 when we spoke about the westward migration, Mormon and Oregon trails. If you went by ship around the tip of South America, it took just as long and far more dangerous. Even crossing Panama by land before the canal existed was not an easy task. But in early 1860s, even as the Civil War raged in the East, Congress approved a bold plan: build a coast-to-coast railroad. Two companies got the job. The Union Pacific Railroad would start in Omaha, Nebraska, and build westward. The Central Pacific Railroad would start in Sacramento, California, and build eastward. The plan sounded simple. The reality, it was brutal. The Union Pacific had to deal with the vast open plains, seemingly endless grasslands, searing heat, bitter cold, and the constant threat of conflict with Native American tribes who saw the railroad as a threat to their land and way of life. The Central Pacific had to face the Sierra Nevada mountains, where granite peaks and snowdrifts over 40 feet high made constructions nearly impossible. Progress slowed to inches a day. And who built it? Immigrants, poor men, risk takers, fighters. The Union Pacific relied heavily on Irish immigrants, many of whom had fled famine and poverty back home. The Central Pacific depended on Chinese laborers, men who worked tirelessly, blasting through rocks hanging from cliffs with dynamites, often in deadly conditions and for far less pay than white workers. Despite the odds, the two railroads kept laying track mile by mile, spike by spike. To speed things up, the government gave huge land grants and cash incentives. For every mile of track laid, companies received land and money, fueling greed, speculation, and sometimes corruption. The faster they worked, the richer they became. And on May 10th, 1869, in a quiet place in Promontory Summit, Utah, the two railroads finally met. The moment was celebrated with the driving of a golden spike, symbolizing not just the completion of the project, but the joining of a nation. Newspapers called it the wedding of the rails. The East and West were no longer strangers. They were now part of the same system, economically, physically, and symbolically. The Transcontinental Railroad had immediate effects. A trip from New York to San Francisco now took about a week. Goods just moved quickly. Settlers could move west. Raw materials like timber, coal, and cattle moved east. The time zones we use still today is a byproduct of Transcontinental Railroad. These time zones were created to keep trains on schedule. But it also had darker consequences. Native American lands were taken, often by force. Buffalo herds were hunted to near extinction, largely to starve native tribes to submission. The railroads didn't just bring settlers, it brought soldiers, guns, and fences. For many, the Transcontinental Railroad was a miracle of modern engineering. For others, it was a beginning of the end of their way of life. But one thing's for sure: once the track was laid, America could never go back. The country had been reshaped, and now it was on the move, faster, further, and louder than ever. The completion of Transcontinental Railroad didn't just connect cities, it reprogrammed the entire rhythm of American life. With the steady clang of steel wheels and shriek of locomotive whistles, the railroad became the engine of a new economy, a new society, and a new kind of ambition. Before railroads, most Americans lived in small, local worlds. You ate food grown nearby, wore clothes that were made locally, and probably never traveled more than a few miles from home. But railroads changed all that. They stretched across states and time zones, tying remote towns to distant markets. Suddenly, farmers in Kansas could ship wheat to bakeries in Boston. Cattle from Texas could be transported to Chicago stockyards and then to restaurants in Philadelphia. Coal from West Virginia, lumber from Oregon, and silver from Nevada could all reach the booming cities of the East. And people moved too. Families boarded trains in New York, Cleveland, or Baltimore with everything they owned, chasing land and opportunity in places they couldn't pronounce. Cheyenne, Boise, Abilene, Tacoma. Entire towns popped up along the tracks, sometimes overnight. They were called boom towns, and many vanished as quickly as they appeared, but others grew into major cities. The railroads also created a new kind of worker, the railroad man. Engineers, brakemen, firemen, telegraph operators, and station agents. The Pullman Company, which made fancy rail cars, hired thousands of African American men, many of them formerly enslaved, as porters. Though the work was demanding and often racist in its expectations, Pullman porters became symbol of black professionalism and played a key role in the rise of black middle class communities. But the power of railroad wasn't just in motion, it was in money. Railroad companies became massive corporations, among first in the US to operate on national scale. They owned lands, towns, and politicians. Some became household names like the Vanderbilts and Leland Stanford, who built fortunes off tracks and ties. With this came corruption. Railroad executives bribed lawmakers, manipulated land deals, and inflated costs. One of the biggest scandals of the era, the Credit Mobilier scandal, involved Union Pacific insiders creating a fake construction company to overcharge the government and pocket the extra cash. Sounds familiar? Even the very structure of time changed. Before the railroad, towns set their clocks based on the position of the sun, meaning noon in one city could be 12:14 in the next. Train schedules were a nightmare. So in 1883, railroads introduced standard time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. It wasn't officially adopted by Congress until 1918, but Americans adapted quickly. Trains had that kind of power. And with that power came a deep divide. The same iron rails that united the country economically also made it easier for power to concentrate in fewer hands. Small farmers felt crushed under shipping rates they couldn't control. Workers saw profits soar for their bosses while their own wages stayed low. Native Americans, pushed from their lands, watched as iron tracks carved through their sacred grounds. So, while railroads trained the nation to think bigger, move faster, and live louder, they also left behind deep questions about fairness, access, and control. The next American icons to ride those rails weren't just passengers. They were men on horseback chasing cattle across the dusty plains, which means it's time to head into the Wild West. When most people hear the word America, there is a good chance a cowboy hat, Clint Eastwood or John Wayne, a dusty trail, and a tumbleweed or two come into mind. Hollywood made it famous, dime novels made it dramatic, but the real story of the cowboy and the Wild West is a lot more interesting than myth. After the Civil War, with the railroads reaching deeper into Texas and the Great Plains, there was a huge demand for beef in the booming cities of East. Cattle ranchers in Texas had the supply, and eastern markets had the money. The only problem was getting the cattle from the open ranges of Texas to the rail hubs in Kansas. Enter the cowboys. Cowboys were hired hands, young men who drove herds of cattle hundreds of miles across dangerous terrain to towns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita, places where railroads could take the beef further east. These journeys were called cattle drives, and they could last weeks or even months. The trail was tough. Cowboys faced stampedes, river crossings, rustlers, bad weather, snakes, and boredom. Despite the iconic image, most cowboys weren't white. Many were black, formerly enslaved men looking for work and independence. Others were Mexican vaqueros, whose technique from roping to riding shaped cowboy culture. There were also Native American cowboys, and even some women who broke the mold. Cowboy life was not glamorous one. It meant long hours in saddle, simple food, and sleeping under stars. Pay was low. Injuries were common, and once the cattle were delivered, most cowboys found themselves jobless until the next drive. But for all its hardship, cowboy culture became a powerful symbol, a rugged, independent figure taming the wild. In a country still figuring out its identity, the cowboy became the poster child for freedom, grit, and masculinity. The towns they rode into where things really got wild. Many western towns were born almost overnight. Dusty streets lined with saloons, general stores, and wooden buildings. Law and order were often whatever the local sheriff could enforce with a barge and a six shooter. Violence, gambling, and chaos weren't just part of the story, they were the story. And yet, these towns also had structure. Schools were built, churches opened, and families settled in. What started as frontier outposts slowly turned into functioning communities. The West was rough, but it was growing. The cowboy era didn't last long, maybe 20 years at its peak. Barbed wire and the expansion of railroads and the rise of large scale ranching made the old cattle drives less necessary. But in that short time, the cowboy made his mark, not just in history, but in the American imagination. And while they wrangled cattle, others were staking their claim on something else entirely: land, independence, and a little slice of the American dream. While cowboys blazed trails across the prairie, another group was quietly reshaping the West in a different way: homesteaders. These were families, often poor, who packed up their lives and moved west not for gold or glory, but for land, their own land. In 1862, during the Civil War, Congress passed the Homestead Act. It was simple but powerful promise. Any US citizen or intended citizen could claim 160 acres of federal land out west. All you had to do was build a home, farm the land, and live there for 5 years. That's it. Just work the soil and the soil would be yours. To people living in crowded cities or struggling in their worn out lands of the East and South, this was a dream come true. Thousands jumped at the chance: former slaves, European immigrants, single women, and families with nothing but a wagon and hope. But the reality was much harder. The Great Plains weren't gentle, green pastures many expected. They were wide, flat, windy, and harsh. Summers brought droughts and prairie fires. Winters buried cabins in blizzards. Insects destroyed crops. Water was hard to find, and loneliness stretched as far as the horizon. Most settlers built homes called sodis, huts made from stacked blocks of sod, thick with roots and dirt. They leaked in the rain, baked in the sun, and sometimes had snakes living in the walls. Still, they endured. Women worked as hard as men, plowing fields, raising livestock, teaching children, and holding families together in isolation. Communities slowly took shape. Schools opened, churches rang their bells, the railroads brought supplies, and small towns began to grow at every station stop. But all of this came at a deep cost to the Native American tribes who had lived on these lands for generations. As homesteaders moved in, native peoples were pushed out. Buffalo herds were wiped out to make room for cattle. Treaties were broken and wars erupted as native resistance was met with military force. The same government offering land to settlers were seizing it from others. Yet, for settlers, the West represented ownership. In a time when land meant power and independence, the homestead was more than property. It was proof that you belonged in this country. The image of prairie family under big sky, simple, hardworking, and hopeful, became a new American ideal. It wasn't always true, but like the cowboy, it stuck. Still, life on the range wasn't fair for everyone. And as farmers began to feel the pressure of rising debts, high railroad prices, and unpredictable markets, they realized they did more than hard work to survive. They needed to organize. Life on the open range tested every ounce of a person's strength. But by the late 1800s, even the hardest working farmers were finding the grit alone wasn't enough. You could plow your field from dawn till dark, harvest your crops right on time, and still end the year in debt. Why? Because while farmers were growing wheat and corn, railroad companies were setting the shipping price, banks were setting the interest rates, and grain buyers were setting the market value. And guess who was always on the losing side? It wasn't just unfair, it was crippling. Farmers across the Midwest and South began to realize something important. If they wanted change, they would need to stand together, so they organized. One of the first major movements was the Grange, officially known as the Patrons of Husbandry, founded in 1867. It started as a social club, a way of isolated farming families to connect, but soon it became political. Grangers pushed for laws that regulated railroad rates, grain storage fees, and monopolies that took advantage of rural communities. Then came the rise of Farmers' Alliance in the 1870s and 1880s, one in the north, one in the south, and even one for black farmers who were often excluded from the white organizations. These groups held massive rallies, published newspapers, and taught their members about cooperative, banking, and voting power. They believed in cooperative economics, where farmers could pool their resources to get better deals on supplies and avoid being squeezed by middlemen. But more than that, they believed that ordinary people should have a voice in how the country worked. Out of this growing wave of frustration and activism came a new political force, populism. A movement that said, enough is enough, the government should work for the people, not just for the railroads, banks, and big businesses. They weren't just demanding cheaper shipping, they wanted to change the entire system from the way money was printed to the way senators were elected. The farmers' movement proved something big. The West wasn't just full of rugged individuals, it was full of ordinary Americans learning how to use their voices together. And in the next election cycles, that voice would get louder. By the late 1800s, farming wasn't just about soil and seasons, it was about money, and more specifically, what kind of money the country should use. This became one of the most heated economic debate in American history, and it all boiled down to two shiny things, silver and gold. Let's break it down. At the time, the US was on gold standard, meaning every paper dollar was backed by a certain amount of gold held by the government. This system was great for bankers, investors, and people with wealth. It kept the value of money stable. But for farmers and working people, especially those in debt, the gold standard felt like chokehold. If there wasn't enough gold in circulation, that meant less money overall, which made loans harder to repay and prices for crops were even lower. Farmers wanted the government to also back money with silver, which was more plentiful. This would create inflation, more dollars in the economy, which could help them pay off debts more easily and raise the price of their goods. So, rallying cry became free silver. Not free as in no cost, but free as in freely minted. Let the government produce silver coins just like it did with gold. This issue wasn't just economic, it became deeply political and emotional. Supporters of silver were often farmers, laborers, and people from the West and South, while defenders of gold were industrialists, bankers, and many from the Northeast. The debate even spilled into culture. Pro silver speeches filled town halls, cartoons mocked gold hoarding elites, and in 1900, author L. Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz, which some believe was a symbolic retelling of silver versus gold debate. At its core, this was a fight over who the economy should serve, the few at the top or many at the bottom. This storm of economic frustration would soon find its voice in a powerful new political movement called populism, and a presidential candidate who could electrify a crowd just by opening his mouth. By the 1890s, America's heartland was restless. Farmers were drowning in debt, railroads were squeezing them with high freight rates, and banks were foreclosing on homesteads. Wages were low, jobs were unstable, and people in small towns and rural counties felt abandoned by government in Washington, D.C. Out of this storm came political rebellion, the populist movement. The populists, also known as the People's Party, weren't just another interest group. They were a full blown political force made up of farmers, laborers, and everyday Americans who believed the country had been taken over by big businesses and big money. They had a platform that was bold for its time, and even radical. They wanted government ownership of railroads and telegraphs to prevent monopolies, a graduated income tax so wealthy paid more. The direct election of US senators, back then they were chosen by state legislatures, shorter workdays for laborers, and free coinage of silver to increase the money supply and help people in debt. The populists believed in empowering the plain people, the farmers, the factory workers, the men and women who kept country running but rarely got a seat at the table. In the election of 1892, they ran James B. Weaver for president. He didn't win, but he got over a million votes. And more importantly, the Populist Party won seats in Congress and gained power in several state governments, especially in the West and South. But the movement had limits. Though they talked about unity, many populist groups in the South excluded black voters, despite black farmers facing the exact same struggles. Meanwhile, business interests in the North painted the populists as wild eyed, socialist, or dangerously radical people. Still, their ideas resonated, so much so that major political parties started copying them. The Democrats, sensing the winds of change, began to echo populist demands, and the Republican Party, representing the business and industry, started preparing to push back. Populism was more than political trend, it was a signal that ordinary Americans were no longer content to be ignored. In the next election, their voices would get even louder when a young man from Nebraska stepped onto the national stage with a thunderous speech and a fiery promise: "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The election of 1896 was more than just a political contest, it was a battle of visions for what kind of country America would become. On one side stood William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic nominee backed by populists and silver advocates. At just 36 years old, he was a magnetic speaker and the kind of man who could hold the crowd spellbound for hours with nothing but his voice. Born in Nebraska, he spoke like the dirt under the fingernails and prairie wind in the lungs. Bryan stood for the people, especially farmers and working class voters who felt crushed by the weight of banks, big businesses, and gold backed money. His most famous moment came at the Democratic National Convention, where he gave a fiery speech defending the free coinage of silver. He ended with the unforgettable line: "You shall not press down upon brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The speech electrified the room. He secured the nomination on the spot, soon became known as the Great Commoner. On the other side was William McKinley, a Republican from Ohio, calm, calculated, and firmly pro business. McKinley promised stability, a gold backed dollar, and industrial growth. His campaign was managed by Mark Hanna, a political strategist who perfected the art of fundraising and used it to flood the country with pro McKinley propaganda. While Bryan crisscrossed the nation by train, delivering hundreds of speeches to cheering crowd, McKinley stayed home in Ohio, letting money and media do the talking. His front porch campaign may have seemed quiet, but it was incredibly effective. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Bryan wanted to shift power to the people, loosen the money supply, and challenge the control of railroads and banks. McKinley stood for big businesses, strong currency, and a national economy tied to industry and expansion. When the results came in, McKinley won decisively, especially in the industrial North and among urban voters. Bryan had strong support in the South and West, but it wasn't enough. The populist dream was fading. Though the movement didn't die overnight, the election of 1896 marked a turning point. The United States had chosen to go with industry over agriculture, gold over silver, and corporations over cooperatives. But many of the populist ideas, like the income tax and direct election of senators, would later become law in the progressive era. Their voices had been heard, even if it was drowned out at the ballot box. The frontier spirit was still alive. But America was moving on faster than ever, and soon it would declare that the frontier itself no longer existed. In 1890, something quietly profound happened. Not in a booming city or in Congress, but in a government office. That year, the US Census Bureau declared that American frontier was officially closed. It meant, simply put, there was no longer a clear line between civilized and unsettled territory. The wide, empty spaces that had once defined the American West were now dotted with towns, fences, railroads, and farms. The frontier as a geographic idea was gone. But emotionally and symbolically, that idea hit like a thunderclap. For over a century, the frontier had been part of America's national identity. It was the land of second chance and promise of reinvention. It shaped how Americans thought about freedom, toughness, and individuality. To many, it was proof that United States was always becoming, always expanding, and always pushing beyond the edge. So, when the frontier disappeared, it raised big questions. What comes next? If there was no more out there, what happens to the American spirit that lived on the edge? That same year, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner gave a speech that became famous, the Frontier Thesis. He argued that the frontier had defined American democracy. It created boldness, independence, and innovation. Without it, he warned, the nation might lose something vital. And he had a point. With the frontier closed, the United States would soon turn its attention outward to overseas expansion, empire building, and global influence. The age of westward conquest was giving way to something new and far more complicated. For Native American nations, of course, the end of frontier was not a line on a map. It was a century of loss, land taken, treaties broken, cultures devastated, and yet many native communities survived, rebuilt, and resisted. Their story is continuing far beyond the closing of the West. The Wild West, once filled with cowboys, cattle drives, gold rushes, and railroads, would now live more in myth than in reality. In dime novels, Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, and eventually in Hollywood westerns. But the impact of this era was very real. It laid the foundation for a new modern America, one powered by trains, steel, and sweat. It reshaped landscapes, laws, and lives, and it left behind a mix of hope, heartbreak, and heritage that still echoes in the American soul today. The frontier was gone, but the journey was far from over. And this has been an episode. Until the next one, use the history as a rearview mirror and stay curious.